Buenos días a todas y a todos.
Good morning to you all and welcome to this second day of the doctoral seminar, Peace and European Values as a Potential Model for Integration and Progress in a Global World within the Research Scholarship of the Charles V European Award that was granted to Professor Sofia Corradi. We begin our second day with a first block that will be moderated by Delia Manzanedo, who is the president of the Association of Philosophy Bajo Palabra and the Word, also doctor and lecturer of philosophy of law at the Rey Juan Carlos University. I'd like to highlight that she is also a member of the European Alumni Network of Yuste, which means that she was one of the recipients of the scholarships, the research scholarships of Javier Solana Madariaga Charles V Award. She was also a member of the jury of the Sofia Corradi Scholarship, and she is a current collaborator of this foundation. Delia, it is always a pleasure and an honor to have you among us. The floor is yours. Very good morning to you all. I would like to thank all the participants for being here and all of you present here today at this doctoral seminar, and the organizers as well, because we have now a long friendship. I would like to thank them for all of the effort that they've made to have you all here. We inaugurate here this second day. Our first speaker will be Jairo Marcos Pérez. The session's title is very ambitious, to discover Europe. It's like the unveiling or the non-hiding of something, in this case the European identity. This is a proposal that is made by Jairo from a perspective of very interesting thinkers like Sepun Maumar or Sousa Santos, among others. As a subtitle, he says, in a very suggestive title, the necessary transformation of Eurocentrism from the peripheries. I'd like to remind you all, as Miguel Ángel Martín very well said, this was a topic that was discussed 7 years ago when the recipient of the Charles V Award was Javier Solana Madariaga. I participated at the time as a researcher, and at the time we talked about the relationships and the ties of the EU and the Mediterranean. So at that doctoral seminar, researchers from Morocco, North of Africa, and in general the Mediterranean took place. That is also where the pre-classic term comes from, the term matria, like Simone Weil used, or Virginia Woolf, or Isabel Allende also discussed this. Matria is the sharing of common values, a classical element of matriarchy, as opposed to the rationalist patria. And the origin of Europe is a link between the Mediterranean eros and the topic of the Mediterranean. That is something that we are also discussing here today. The function of this seminar is to disseminate ideas as if they were flowers in the Mediterranean that are impregnating the tissue that is Europe. So little by little, we're all making a koinon logo, a common reason to vertebrate and to be the backbone, so that we can discuss about values and common values of European and non-Europeans. Jairo will discuss the necessary transformation of Europe, because he discusses that the history of Europe has been done in between civilization and barbarism, and so it is the time for Europe to rebuild itself once again. We need to open Europe to citizens. That Europe is essential if we want to promote the renaissance of Eurocentrism that is sustainable and humanist. In order to have more Europe, Europe based on social rights, culture, universities, mobility. In order to achieve that, we need more than ever creating opportunities, possibilities, participative democracy spaces, so that we can recover that essence of Europe, to get back to the radical idea of Europe, and by radical I mean the roots, as a space for equality, peace, solidarity, hospitality, which is what Europe used to be. And so we hope that these will be the values that are imposed, instead of just having the Europe of Brexit, divorce of institutions and citizens, borders, because Europe now is fighting to overcome exclusive nationalism and to find a common Spain of freedom, which is what Europe has always been. The civilized civic model with one single voice, Europe of solidarity, and Europe of the future of its youth, which is very important. And here among us we have a great model for the fight of the youth, which is represented here by Sofia Corradi. When I say we need to humanize Europe, I do not mean that we should do crazy things and extravagance. We need to open the recognition of others. We need to provide assistance so the most vulnerable are included. We necessarily need education. Europe and Spain are what they are and have been what they've been, thanks to that education to knowledge and the philosophical revision that Jairo is going to show us now. I think that is based on the progress, because everything has to be based on the culture and on its society. I'm excited to see that we can follow what Ibsen used to say about how revolution has to begin at the brain and the heads of everyone, and we need to keep on building on that slower but also more solid path, which is the one that is based on the education. I think in the classroom and seminars like the one here, that is where good human relationships happen, where good relationships among knowledge happens. That is precisely on this space of open dialogue, open to the media, where the world, a different world that we want, is incubated. Education is a weapon, a necessary weapon to progress and to get out of the economic crisis, and it is essential to talk about the integration of Europe. Education is the best weapon to fight totalitarianism, like the ones that we are having in the European Union. When I think of these topics, I remember the words of Ángel Gabilondo, who used to be my teacher at university. He said that the most rebel shouting or cry is the call to go to the classrooms. It's not the same as a call to war or call to weapons. It's not the same having a book than having tanks or having the army in the streets, but that is the weapon that we have. The word, education, wisdom, and I think that these are the weapons that we can use in order to in order to go from the peripheries that some have discussed. Jairo, is your turn, and the word is your weapon. Thank you.
Buenos días a todas y a todos.
Good morning to you all. Thank you, Delia, for your presentation, and thanks to all those organizers in the foundation that facilitate these gatherings, which invites to think, and thinking is a rebellious act, all things considered. I come from journalism and philosophy. People ask me whether they have anything in common, and the truth is that both fields revolve around the question. The other night we were speaking about what contribution our papers were going to make, whether they were going to be original. I'm not sure whether my proposals are original or not, but I would be happy if they are at least the questions of all the time, but which are heard in a different way. I give importance to the question, and I was thinking of starting about Europe, which is not exactly the European Union. I was thinking of starting by asking, what is Europe? But yesterday, I was taking notes of several concepts that are linked to Europe, and I noted, for instance, human rights, peace, reason, freedom, progress. All of them, I was noting them with a capital initial letter, because when we speak about peace, we speak about peace in general, human rights in general, progress or freedom in general, with a capital letter. If we ask about why, we would think that Europe is as the heir of the Greek democracy, of the conquering spirit of modernity, and it is usual to speak about the European exceptionality, Europe as a center and end of history. This is translated in reality in hegemony, both military and economic, but also philosophical, cultural. From the end of the 17th century or the 18th century, which is the Enlightenment, Europe is considered as the beginning of the age of reason and the light, and then the beginning of progress. History from there is the evolution. What happens in Europe is the history with a capital H. As a result, we have a temporary sequence, Greece, Rome, and Europe. This sequence with a linearity. Greece and Rome is linked with the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. Then the Reformation in Germany in the 16th. Illustration, Germany, 16th to 18th century. The British Parliament, the 18th century, and then the French or Industrial Revolutions, where we will be in France or in England in the 18th century. All these building is where philosophy participates. Lyotard calls the great narrative to this idea, and all philosophy participates practically without exceptions. What is taught in classrooms, what we all get. Media participate also of that idea, and when I say that from the Enlightenment, all philosophers participate in it, we can talk of Rousseau, Hegel, without whom it wouldn't be possible to speak of philosophy, but also philosophers critical like Marx, apparently critical like Marx, who follow this great narrative, or the father of sociology like Max Weber, or contemporary people like Gianni Vattimo, a European member of parliament who has been very active in this thesis. This is the reality which I face, what I have, and when I start thinking in my thesis and the paper I intend to present here for the foundation. And I'm in front of this reality, and I question it. My point of departure is not to try and make a thesis about an author in particular, but I ask myself what happens if we deconstruct all this scaffolding where the philosophy is established and the idea of Europe as well. It's a sort of explanation of the world through phenomena which are exclusively European, which is Eurocentric. The history, according to Walter Benjamin, is what is written by victors, but we should add that it is acted by victors, defeated, and everybody else. So we arrive at close categories that need a revision, like, for instance, the European exceptionality, the concept of discovery, of modernization, which seem very natural, very obvious, like growth, development. I don't intend to deny in a simplistic manner the modernity in Europe, but a transformation. I want to overcome a first Eurocentrism that explains history through exclusively European phenomena and speak of a different Eurocentrism where we are installed right now. Even if it is true that it attracts for explanations phenomena which come from outside Europe, it is done through a European matrix, which is the white heterosexual man and rich. It is not simply a simplistic negation of Europe, but what could be called a mythological liberation of the European ego. This phrase, cogito ergo sum, is Descartes, 17th century philosopher. I think, therefore I am. Through this saying of Descartes is based all philosophical thought, and the Eurocentric thought is also built on this. What does it mean? There is a subject, I, the verb cogito, which is above the others, what surrounds it, and is self-sufficient to have the reason not only to dominate the world, but that his reason is the only valid one, the one that prevails. This has consequences. First, we should say that this phrase, Kant, will continue with Ich denke by Kant, Marx, ich arbeite, I work, and then they continue with this idea of the I, the European I, ego, which has two consequences, I was saying, in my view, quite serious, over which the Eurocentric philosophy has not reflected sufficiently. The first, cogito, means I think. But when one has the need to say I think, we are excluding others from thinking. If I reveal my need to think, is that I think other persons are not thinking. The second term is even worse. If I say that I am, is because there are others that are not, that do not exist. This is what I call peripheries of diverse geographies, where I place my reflection. Those peripheries of geographical diversity, Eduardo Galeano calls it the nobodies, Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the absences, Franz Fanon, the damned of the earth. There are many different ways of calling it. Finally, is to convert or change a space in a conflict sphere, not only of physical borders. Europe has physical borders, but besides there are others, gender, economic, cultural borders. When we come to think of it, it is not the same to be born in Chiapas or in Paris, or to be born a man or a woman, even thinking outside the binarism of gender, or to be the conductor of a symphonic orchestra, or weaving cane or something like that. I mean, there are many differences. All this ideological fabrication is a vested one. The building of the concept of Europe, I think, is based on this ideological building or construction. There are two terms of a dichotomy, of a relationship, or a hierarchy of asymmetrical terms. On the one hand, the I, the same, the self, the totality, which is the wholeness, which is identified with I, the man, the white, etc. And on the other side, the alterity, the non-human, women, etc. So all the weight falls in the first on the first pole. Philosophy goes a step further. And I speak of making guilty, and the slave is a slave by nature, which should be translated, those underdeveloped countries, they are by nature, they are underdeveloped. So we should ask from them a sacrifice so that they should modernize. It is not only this consequence. We could say that, for instance, the term or the concept of truth belongs to identity, to the self, to us, to those white European men that make it universal through human rights, through science, through progress, through different elements. But obviously, when I define the self as opposed to the non-being, or the being against the non-being, the human against the non-human, there is a weak and a strong pole, but they are both tied. So there is a paradigm relation where the future of both is inextricably united. This is what I turn to the European field to say that Europe is or cannot be without the multiple peripheries that build it. The key, from my point of view, is to decline, or rather to make the declension in plural lowercase words. What Vatimo says a weak thought, and Enrique Dustel comes to my mind to think of another idea, to speak of this reality in lowercase words. I will explain this in three parts. The Greek miracle, the concealment of the other and not the discovery of the other in the age of discoveries, and then the modernity. From these reflections, I understand that there is a detour of an ideological and philosophical nature of what used to be the linearity that said Greece, Rome, Europe. If we start looking into the roots of what Greece was about, mythologically, Greece was a daughter of Phoenicians, a Semitic origin, nothing Western. Geographically, you have a map here. The main thesis that appears in any handbook, classical Greece, we speak between 5th and 4th centuries before Christ. This is in red is the Greek world. All the rest is barbarism, the inhuman, the uncivilized par excellence. So the barbarism or the uncivilized is where later on the first Europe will be. Strong Europe of France, Germany, etc. will be located. But the next Roman Empire doesn't change much the situation. The main focus, based on Latin language, goes towards the west, and originary Greece stays in the east. So, when we argue that Europe is originated in Greece, one should make nuances, because Greece had already Oriental nuances itself. We could speak about the fabrication of Greece, both in historical and philosophical terms. In philosophical terms, it's commonly said that where does philosophy come from? Greek philosophy was born in Greece, but if you see the map, that Greece was close to the Nile, the Black Africa. Part of that Greece was what today is Turkey, or the pre-Socrates philosophers that come from the periphery of Greece. When we approach the Ottoman universe, in the end of the day, it is a paradigm. We don't know where we are confronting the same or something different in Europe. I have that not that clear in my mind. And in historical terms, it's also a fabrication of Greece, because there are two models to explain Greece. On the one hand, the ancient model, which explains Greece as Levantine culture, with influence from Egypt and the Semitic roots. That is the model which the Greeks grew up with. They received influences from other cultures. It is in the 18th and 19th century with German Romanticism where the Aryan model is created. It is the model we have grown up with, the Aryan model, where some features are eliminated. The Phoenician or Egyptian influence is eliminated, and they speak of invasions from the north, which are not documented historically, or if they are documented, are not so relevant as to erase the Phoenician and Egyptian nuances. For the German romantics that were looking for purity, it was unthinkable in the 18th century that Greece, that was considered the maximum, the childhood of Europe, had any relation with cultures like African cultures that had a colonial past and where slavery, the blacks, etc., were located. From all that, from that German Romanticism, the development fallacy, an interpretation of history that believes in historical linearity, which links that Greece with that Rome with today's Europe. But look, from Rome to Europe, from the Italian Renaissance, the 15th century, there are 15 centuries approximately. Then there is the racist hypothesis, and I refer on this to the thesis explained by Darwin, the natural selection, only the fittest survive, the blondest survive, and the application of those positions of the natural world to geopolitics or international relations. In the first moment, we speak of genetic racism, that exceptionality of Europe is because Europeans were considered superior to the others, and later on, that racism has been nuanced, and we can speak of geographical racism, which is still prevailing today. When we speak about the two Europes, the second speed or the lowest speed Europe is in the south. It's curious that all the third world belong to the south. When we speak of pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, it is curious that all these countries are from the periphery, from the south of Europe. This is the racist hypothesis in the geographical sense of the matter. Summarizing, what I wanted to say is that that sequence, Greece, Rome, Europe, is not that simplistic. As you see in this mental graph, which you have on the screen, modern Europe links with Greece not only through Greco-Latin world, but also the Arab, Muslim, also black and Jewish. It will be only after Renaissance when there is the confrontation with the Ottoman Empire and the false equation between Western equal to Hellenistic, Roman, etc. falls. So we should question also Christianity as one of the bases of Europe. It should be nuanced as well, because it wasn't born in the banks of the Rhine River. We should make a distinction between what is Christianity and what is to be a Christian, really. That's the first point of the Greek miracle. The second point I want to table is the concealment of the others. We are at the end, in the Europe of the end of the 15th century. Europe was then a peripheral and secondary culture. We shouldn't forget that Europe in the East in those days was under siege the doors of today's Vienna until 1681. The Ottoman Empire was around there, and there was no exit from in the south. From Seville onwards, there was a different cultural world. The Muslims, there was no way out there. What happens at the end of the 15th century when Europe leaves behind the Mediterranean and it opens to the Atlantic Ocean, which means epistemologically, or for the building of the European self, a great change. Europe does not only leave behind the Mediterranean, but also the European Middle Ages. And not only Middle Ages, but when we speak of periodization in history, we speak of Middle Ages, we believe between the 12th and the 15th century. But European Middle Ages coincides as a footnote as the maximum splendor of the Muslims. It was the enlightenment of the Arab world. So when we speak of Middle Ages, we should nuance to what we are referring to and to whom we are referring to. At the end of the 15th century, Europe opens itself to the Atlantic. First with Portugal in 1415, when they take Ceuta in Africa. Then it confronts the other, the African. And in 1492 is the arrival to America. Europe, center and end of history, begins to think that to see that there are others. In the Africas, Africa is not a country, it's a continent with 57 countries. The others of India, of China, of all these others, the most important one, due to the radical otherness of non-being, because it was not known, is the American Indian, the indigenous people from America. I'm going to make a brief parenthesis here. We speak of discovery, and the idea of discovering is this double presence, the one that discovers, the agent, and the other that is discovered, who is a patient subject in a way. So what happens? The agent and subject discovers something that was already there as in potentially is 16-year-old football player has all the potential, but one has to exploit it. The potential is there, but one has to put it into action. Well, with discoveries is exactly the same. The object is already there, is a given. The patient subject is there, but it is the agent subject that the one that unveils it to reveal its existence, an existence that was already given. How do you do that? When we confront something totally novel, as it was a radical other, as in those days was the Indian other, the other American, as human beings, it is difficult to grasp a totally different reality. If you try to explain a unicorn to a little child, the best form is not to say that it's a mythological animal with special characteristics, etc. The best way is to say it's a mixture of a horse with a horn. With the things that you know, the child will learn something that is totally alien to them. If we transfer this to the end of the 15th century, it means that when Europeans meet the other American, they assimilate the other. How do they do that? How do they give reality to it? Through a sort of culturization, a civilization, a conquest. It is the ethical illusion that Europe considers that it can live without the others. They assimilate the others so much that they rape their women, they make them slaves, etc. If we go back to 1492, if we wonder that agent subject, who that subject was, in the agent subject of discovery, the great discoverer has been considered by history Christopher Columbus, but there were other adventurers like Vasco da Gama, Enrique de Portugal, Bartolomeo Diaz, all white, well-placed and male Europeans. So the agent subject in the discovery is basically a European man. When Christopher Columbus leaves the European ports, he had the idea that he was going through the tropical Atlantic and that he was going to find the Indies. This map is from 1489, just before the Columbus voyage, and it represents how in those days the voyage of Columbus was not to meet another radically different other, but with another part of Europe. The nuance is very important, because going back to what I was saying before, Europe didn't expect to find something radically different, radically other, but with another part of itself. What happens? Columbus dies thinking that that map was still valid. He's not aware that he has discovered a fourth part of the Earth. With the passing of time, what is clear is that it is a fourth part, which is not another part of Europe. This brings us to that ego cogito. From the ego cogito, direct consequences, I conquest, I think, is the antecedent is I conquer. Since the European man could not assimilate this, it impregnates it with its values. And from there on, we can talk of a modernity, and I will link with my third reflection, vehicle along three periods. The early modernity from 1492 until 1815, that first stage were under the hegemony of Hindustani and Chinese influence. At the beginning, I was saying that modernity was located at the end of the 17th or beginning of the 18th century, and now I have advanced it to the end of the 15th century. It's curious that official history, the century that is eliminated as early modernity, is the century where two powers, European powers, but peripheral powers, were the ones that were leading at that time operations, which were Spain and Portugal. So the building of Europe leaves aside the periphery. Then it comes mature modernity between 1815, which coincides with the Industrial Revolution, and I leave it open why, if Europe was a colonial and peripheral world, how could it be that in Europe was the place where the Industrial Revolution took place? Or should we nuance that as well? I'm not going to enter that point, but the debate is would lead us very far, and there are many authors that have been talking around that about that. The mature modernity, 1815, 1840, 1945, and then the late modernity, although periodization is very complicated for complex phenomena, but it helps to figure out a historical map from 1945 to 2001, which coincides 1945 with the boom of the American Empire, and the 2001 with the Twin Towers attack and the Porto Alegre Forum. There are authors that refer to the postmodern period with Lyotard's book. So postmodernity starts in 2001, and we have two paradigms to understand what modernity or modernities are. First, the European paradigm, which implies that when explaining different phenomena, we resort only to arguments or explanations of European roots. Scientific revolution, Europe. Human rights, only Europe, where the West should be included, also the United States and Japan. However, the figure on the right is a different paradigm to understand modernity. It is a more planetary horizon. From 1815, Europe is more in the center, that Asian hegemony gives way to a more Western hegemony. But modernity in this second figure should be understood as the management that a part of the world makes of centrality. When Spain had the power, Spain was the one that imposed the concept of truth, the one that managed that from a part of the world, the central part of the world, was the whole world was administered or managed. Later on, it was France or the Netherlands who administered that the world. As a last reflection, and from now on, what? What do we do with modernity? What do we do with Europe? We have several possibilities. First, the one that the system usually takes. Let us modernize the world. Let us modernize the peripheries. In the hard model of this solution is, for instance, the one imposed or suggested by the Troika, the European Commission, IMF, and the World Bank. They come with a European recipe and they apply it to all the peripheries. The soft model of this first idea would be, for instance, microcredit. Microcredits per se are no good or bad per se. When we speak of cooperation, microcredits, quite often when the microcredit model is pushed in a place in Africa or in Latin America, is to require from those beneficiaries of the microcredits to open a current account, even if it's only with €1. So they are persons which were outside the model. They are turned into people with a bank account. This is a soft model. There is a second option as well, would be to improve modernity, improve Europe, which is the one opted by postmoderns, like Habermas, who speaks of the community of an ideal communication, or Vatimo. What does Habermas mean? An ideal dialogue where all voices are enabled. We ask whether an inclusive dialogue would be sufficient for all the peripheries. In my view, I fear that this is not possible. And there's the third option, which is the one I suggest, which is to transform modernities and transform Europe. To be aware of that ideology that is behind the building of Europe, of the building of modernity, that naturalized narrative, or that linear teleology, or the historical sequence which makes objective the world, or to say what truth with a capital T is. What is achieved that there is that market economy is progress, that democracy means to vote every 4 years, and well, taking or being aware of this, and in a second stage, tending to certain liberations, the solution should be sought. Why do I speak of liberations? Following the maps would be to open conceptual and geographical cartographies of which are diverse with other worlds, but not at their cost, but with them. In this context, I think that the fundamental issue is that there's a lot at stake. And it is that in the final analysis, what is at stake is the European identity, the European culture, European values, the European challenges, and challenges like the drama of the refugees, the precarization of so many people. It is at stake future generations, the squandering of nature. So these are important questions. If Europe does not reflect on its own barbarism, not for self-complacency, but to be aware of its own relation with the others, we will continue building a non-humanity. And I hope we are still in time to have a planetary vision in which we can build a common future. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Jairo, for your suggestive presentation. You have brought on the table very complex different topics. I'm sure that you're willing to intervene. There will be a lot of questions. So we open the floor so that you can ask all sorts of questions.
Maite.
My thesis is not seen from this perspective because I analyze the European archives. So my perspective is from Europe to Latin American. But I think it's very interesting because many of the things that you said were in my files, the comments that I found in these files, and I've not focused on that. But it has a lot of relation to what you say. This is going to be more of a remark rather than a question. For instance, once the European Parliament MPA from the right wing said that Latin Americans did not want to help ourselves and it was our fault to be in the dump. Obviously, there are different voices in the Parliament of Europe. And so the traditional discourse was not the one of that member of parliament of the right side. There were many from the left. So the discourse is we need to help them to help themselves. It was not as extreme, but very suggestive as well. Then there is a different topic, which is that of drugs. Another right-wing MP, said that they needed to deal with the drug problem because we need to help the youth from Europe. Other members of parliament said that there was co-responsibility of those who sell and those who buy, and that was the discourse and the point of view of the parliament and of the whole community. And so it was very interesting what you said, because I found many of the things that you said on this text. When you talked about the Middle Ages, that is something that I have already discussed, because in the Middle Ages, if you were Europe, and if you see at the trading map of the Middle Ages in the world, it was just more Northern Africa, Asia. That is why we question for how long Asia has been in crisis, because in the global history we do not see this. And in fact, Latin America and the Inca Empire was doing very well right before the Europeans arrived, except for the last few years there was an internal war, a conflict between two brothers who wanted the power after the father died. And that's when the Spaniards arrived. Then they struck a deal with one of the brothers. They won over the other brother, and then they betrayed him. So a different point of view for history is very interesting always. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comment. I would like to say that besides, we're not talking about left and right, because the left in Europe is still building myths like that of growth, because economic growth is seen differently from the left and the right, but they keep on talking about the, for instance, the trade unions in the north of Europe. They see something that is bad for the north as something good for the south, and vice versa. And with regard to trading relations, I agree with Yuste. Gunther Frank is a very interesting author who talks about how the commercial trade up until 1815, it was on the Asian axis. From the sentence, I think, therefore I exist, how do you get to this white, male, heterosexual, European, tall, blonde, blue eyes? That is, how do you get from that sentence, because it can be interpreted in many ways, and how did you arrive to the core of your thesis, the basis of Europe? I'd like to know what type of authors you've based yourselves. Maybe some other authors have made you rethink that thesis, or did you know from the very beginning what you wanted to discuss? I know that you already explained, because you discussed that the discoverers of Europe, they were male, they were Europeans, but I think the reflection that you did internally is much more deeper, so I would like to know how you went from cogito ergo sum onto that. Even if it's a philosophy PhD, I haven't done that on my own. Of course, I have maintained a dialogue with philosophers in books, and also authors, professors. But I wanted to add that nuance, because the philosophers that come to us from the academia, they are pretty much the same always, like Kant. It's on the German Empire, and Descartes on the Dutch Empire. Locke, who discussed the slave trade, he had a slave trade company, so we do not get the lives of philosophers, but we do know that those are the white males that write history.
Your presentation. It was really refreshing to see this kind of a new approach to the European history. Actually, I was just recently reading a very good book by an Oxford professor. His name is Frankopan. It's also the similar kind of narration of European history, and he actually tells European history through the narrative of the roots. So there are roads, and there are different kind of roads. And on that note, the book is called Silk Road. So today we are having some kind of revisiting of the Silk Road that one existed between the ancient Europe and the China. So how would you comment that as well? This rebuilding of the same, old kind of Silk Roads, economic kind of connections with China. And also, there was this kind of recent soft kind of policy of the European Union, which is about to become very important. It's called Europe as Cultural Superpower. It was presented by Federica Mogherini just recently, but in comparison with other, of course, European institutions, with Elmar Brok and with others. And they are now having this kind of new idea of soft power for Europe, and it's called Europe Cultural Superpower. So even using this term, it's really disturbing for me because I live in Belgium, and, the Belgium has never dealt with the colonial history, and now still you have people like speaking about the good old days in Africa. So how would you comment that, from your philosophical point of view? Thanks.
No, muchas gracias por la referencia.
Thank you very much for this bibliography. I didn't know about the author. I did know about the author, but not the book. So I'd like to read it. I've discussed with other authors like Black Athena. But when I discussed my PhD, I had many difficulties finding a tutor because my co-directors are from Spain and Mexico, of the UNAM in Mexico, but here I found it very difficult to find experts in the field on somebody who wanted to direct my PhD, not just because they did not dare doing so, but because they admitted that they did not know anything about them. I suggested some authors and they did not know them. So there are not many experts in the field. With regard to the soft power, that reminded me of when we discuss European cooperation. Under the term cooperation is there are some other economic interests hidden. And that also reminded me, in 1492, we talk about the encounter of two worlds, but talking about encounter when the historical tale tells us that there was a massacre, it's a bit hard because there are some word games that helps to naturalize a certain truth and to build a narrative. And so we polish a little bit the history and we tell it as we want to. Before they ask other questions, I thought it was very interesting to see the reviewing because philosophy also offers a perspective of a revision of those European values. When we came here, many told us, what would we say to our students when they tell us that philosophy has no use? Well, I would invite them to come to this type of seminars and hear this type of speeches and widen our perspective, because many times our national and supranational laws have their own basis on constitution. When they say, for instance, that education is essential and that is based on our rights and duties, when we really don't know what they are, and we don't know what is our European identity, our citizenship. So we need to reassess those elements and be based on this type of reflections, because if we do not know what our democratical principles are, how are we going to apply them? If we lack the knowledge, then it's difficult. And the perspective that you've given us, the concept of democracy, citizenship, freedom, Professor Jürgen Helbert on the first day made a very important and interesting reflection how the concept of freedom was applied in an opposite way depending on which side of Germany we were talking about. So your perspective of Europe from a critical perspective towards its own basis, what would be your proposal what would be your line of work with regard to research that you would propose to these Europeists, for those who think that Europe has to be thought in different terms? Well, it's a very wide question. It could be applied to many fields, but you mentioned one concept, the one of citizenship. How about instead of talking about citizenship, we would talk about the caring of our citizens? In Spanish, you just have to change one single letter. That's not a term that I have coined myself. From the feminist perspective, we highlight what is behind the economy based on GDP, because GDP is sometimes the basis for the economy, and there are a certain set of parameters that do not measure the care economy. What is the care economy? Well, it is all the activities that are done within the household, and they do also generate economy. For instance, take a worker that has to be working from 8 to 2 and 5 to 7. Well, obviously at a certain time he needs to wash his clothes, he needs to eat, he needs to sleep. All of those activities are mainly done by women. They're caring activities that are outside the scope of the economy or the traditional and orthodox economy, but they're part of the real economy, in fact. With this concept of the economy of care, we're trying to set on the table all the hidden values, the lives of women mostly, that are also holding the economy of a country together. So we could talk, instead of citizenship, of the economy of care. We want to continue this debate, and you have mentioned very important elements. Now we have the far right getting more power in Europe, and we have those different speeches and discourses by Bátimo, for instance. So what is your perspective with regard to this involution, or this, because they are ending with the well-being of Europe? Because if you ask for a new model of Europeism, what we need now is not just criticism, but also a proposal for reform. What is your vision before everything that is happening? Because I believe that we are living an exceptional time. In 2016, we said to ourselves it's impossible that Brexit will succeed, Donald Trump will not be a president, then Marine Le Pen in France. So there are many things that are becoming truth, even if we didn't believe so. So I think it's very interesting to see the perspective of all of these authors, because they allow us to see the polyedric reality, and they widen the framework as well for us. So I think we can face all of these problems that we are facing, and from the periphery, maybe we can suggest a more emancipating perspective of the authoritarian regressions. We thought that these voices had been left in the past, in a non-glorious past of Europe, but sometimes it is important to remember traumas. Hederling used to say that it was only from the moment of the greatest fall where we can hope for renaissance. Among all the authors that you have discussed and you have studied, how do they see this reality that we are living amongst? How do they study what is happening now? Do they think it's part of the Eurocentric point of view, that Europe is just looking at itself, that we are blindly optimistic and we are ignoring the voices of periphery? So what is their perspective? If we see the geographical map of Europe, all of the political expressions in Europe are just a way of defending itself. When the European ego is threatened, then you try and back yourself in your own fortress. The ego in Italy, in France, in Spain, they're just building defense. The European ego is abstract, but is also threatened. So the proposal is, what happens if we debilitate the European identity, if we decline a different pool to talk about not Europe, but Europes in general, that there is a diverse Europe, but it can be united as well. What would happen if, through that weakened identity, would we have as many problems? So I think the proposals will come from that perspective. Miguel has a question for you. If you allow me, I'm very passionate about your topic, and from the foundation we have discussed this topic in different fora, in different networks that we work in. There are two questions that that caught my attention. First of all, maybe you can show us the Mediterranean map again, from the antique Greece, that's considered to be the center of the world, that Mediterranean and the coasts where trading was done. There you think of Europe in the middle of the Mediterranean and Central Mediterranean and the periphery as well. And you think about the rest as barbarians. But maybe in your work you could also see the other point of view. Because when we see this map in the image, it seems as if the whole civilization was in those coasts of the Mediterranean, and then they started moving. How did they do it? But it seems as if everything that was outside of that red area, there was just lack of knowledge, brutality, barbarism. But in those spaces, civilizations were being built, where they had thinkers, and there was an economic and trading development. Maybe it was not just as rich and wealthy as the one in the Mediterranean, but there was some. Now we tend to say as well the center of Europe, the center of the world is Europe and the periphery is in its borders, but we are lacking the other side, the opposite side. What was happening at the time outside of the Mediterranean, and what happened? How was the leap made from the Mediterranean to the center of Europe? I don't know if you've studied that in your work, but I think it would be interesting to gather the two opposite visions, because many times when we talk about the other, we're missing the vision of that other. On the other hand, as well, getting back to the current period of time, we tend to speak idly about the periphery. You discuss the pigs, the south. It seems like they said that everything is decided in the center, and they underestimate the south and the pigs. But I am working in different organizations discussing that. And so the periphery is not the only one that needs to defend itself. I think it's too radical to say that there is the center of Europe that tries to Europeanize the rest of the world and impose its own criteria, versus what is happening in the peripheria and the peripherics that is not as important. But there is an opposite movement that I think should be interesting to analyze from the civil society, because many times our perspective is from a political view, but we should take into account citizenship as well. And citizens are given also an important role to play. I don't know if you've taken that into account. but maybe it would be interesting to discuss that. Starting by your second question, I agree with you that the periphery cannot defend themselves, even though they need to empower themselves and be aware to defend themselves. Although there is a whole movement, even in the center of Europe, that is showing solidarity with the periphery, I have the feeling that what Marx said about the proletariat to come together, I have the feeling that the center of power is further away from the periphery, and the peripheries are lacking protection, and also peripheries are not showing solidarity with one another, or not strong enough to do the counter-hegemonic powers. I think that's the great challenge. The great challenge is to have alternative proposals to what is being proposed from the center of Europe. For instance, in Central European countries are suggesting this? Well, yes, but the center is hiding the peripheries. For instance, in Spain we have peripheries. We have people that do not have a house, they have their house seized. Suicides during economic crisis have increased dramatically. Those are peripheries, and there are things being done. But up until now, we've had not valid enough or credible enough alternatives so that transformations are being made possible, and so that they are made into material measures. With regard to your first question, all of that blank space that I denominated barbarians, that was from the Greek perspective. But of course there were other thinkers and other economies that, of course, we have not had come towards us. Same as the others now are not Europe. If I might. Following what Miguel Ángel said, I was thinking about the same, the type of critical discourse that tries to unveil that all try to have a legitimacy, that discourse that tries to unveil the myths of liberalism, neutrality, that tries to undermine them and makes us see that there will always be some political powers and hegemony, and they will think of themselves as the nucleo and the center. I think that is clear. It's a skeptical and critical, radical way of thinking that goes against having a legitimacy in the law. But not in a perfect way. I think we have a corpus of human rights, and even though we are critical with them, we need to have them as well, because not all of us could be skeptical, and we could not just think that politics and race and class, that's not everything. If it was, then citizens will lose all hopes. Because if our political leaders are skeptical, then there is no hope. So there is a pragmatical contradiction, because this type of discourses are positioning themselves near the less favored peoples. They're trying to reivindicate the rights of third world countries to raise awareness, but also those countries will be lost if they were not recognized within the international law where they need to take part. So I think criticism should stop at a point so that it keeps its coherence. We cannot strike a commitment with practicality and then renounce to establish the rational criteria to have a conviviality among all. I don't know if I'm clear. Yes, of course, there are hinge questions. I'm not talking about a fight between classes. We're not trying to free the slaves, but rather that freedom should be for all, for those that have the slaves and for the slaves themselves, masters and slaves. So we're not trying to fall in relativism, that in everything goes, but rather the ecology of wisdoms, like Sosa Santos would say, so that we should all know that our culture has a validity criterion, but it also ignores others that could give other cultures. So our culture should not necessarily be superior to others, but at the same time rejecting relativism where all points of view cannot be defended, because then intellectually we would get back to the start once again. It would be the absolute relativism. On the same line, I was thinking that without criticism there is no evolution. When you were talking, I was reminding the liberation theology and what is the big reaction within the European Catholic Church. I'm not talking about the Europeans, because there are many nuns and priests in Latin America coming from Europe that belong to this way of thinking. But here in Europe they said that it is valid, that's liberation theology, but only for Latin America. That is the view in general. So maybe you have seen that. I know it has not much to do with your sources, but maybe you've seen that. Then I wanted to ask a second question. I'm giving you the data, the contact of a German thinker. When you discuss the center and the periphery, there is a Chilean author, David Valdés. You know him? It's very interesting because he discusses that the center and the periphery is not in relation with Europe, but also with the Asian relations. In different regions, there are this type of links. So it's not just exclusively European phenomenon. And then I would like to make an analysis on the present and ask you about it. What do you think about the South-South cooperation? Now it is in fashion, in vogue. Now we're talking about a triangular cooperation, not just South-South. What do you think about the BRICS? And going back to what you previously discussed, as an anecdote, I would like to say that when I arrived here, I was very surprised with the difference of what we had studied in school. I did a master, an international master, so there were people from all over the world, and we studied world history, which meant European history. So we knew everything that had happened in the First and Second World War, but also the previous wars in Europe. So all of us who were not Europeans, we asked these Europeans what they had studied at school. Well, they had no idea of what had happened in our regions outside of Europe. And I found that interesting. I have not seen the curriculum of schools in different European countries, but by the questions that I was asked, I think that they did not study anything else than Europe. Maybe if they were Spaniards, they would have seen what happened in Latin America, but it does not belong to the curriculum. And so maybe it would be interesting to add that, to know other stories and histories. I'm glad you talk about the liberation theology. I'm not just going to discuss that, but one of the philosophers that I discuss the most, Enrique Dussel, he's the father of that theology. Like Leonardo Boff, for instance, the ecology of the poor, church, etc. From that type of theology of liberation and from philosophy, they suggest the criticism in the world, and there are some who will oppose, because rights are not graciously given, they're conquered. Sometimes there have been some rights that have been conquered through bloodletting. So Europe has to open the question of violence, of how terrorism and who defines terrorism. Those are questions that have to open from philosophy. They have to be open without taboos. Please later on give me the bibliographic references. With regard to South-South cooperation, I think is necessary, and it was a model that was needed. But then we have giants coming up like Brazil. So it's more like a South-South nuance cooperation, because Brazil becomes also the master, the hegemonical center of dialogue. So we need to be careful, because there is a need for South-South cooperation, but we need to be careful on nuances. With regard to education, I couldn't agree more. I'm still ashamed that if you see a school book, and it still seems that Christopher Columbus is just the discoverer of America without nuances. We also discuss the Middle Ages as the Middle Ages, but they are only from Europe. And Paulo Freire also discusses the banking system. He discusses the pedagogy of liberation, and he says that standard education consists on repeating what the teacher said. You just write exactly what your teacher says at school, and that's it. You get the highest score. So I think we should rethink pedagogy and transform it. Not just the teacher giving knowledge to those students who just repeat, without losing authority, but dialogue should be strong. You're messing with teachers, so be careful. If I think of my classes, I teach law philosophy, and you try and give examples of the Civil War of Spain or the two Great Wars. And some people are very reticent to discuss the past. There are some youngsters who just think of the present. They think that everything is already invented, but they do not think of the past. So I think that in Latin America is a bit different, because history is alive and students have a more interactive relationship with the teacher. I don't know what happened in Spain, because the educational programs discuss history in a different way. I think it's dangerous to forget history. If we do not remember all of the efforts that were made in order to enjoy over 50 years of peace and stability, then that's dangerous, because yesterday they discussed how our grandparents would go to the trenches, we would just go to the Erasmus. So not remembering that would be a grave mistake. History, philosophy, all of these human sciences that are now losing importance in favor of finance and maths and counting. I think that having the social sciences on a second scene, I think that is dangerous, because those sciences live from our human failures. We have already cited some. I remember Baudelaire, Les Fleurs du Mal. They were going to be called the capital sins of mankind, but in the end he wanted to think of way of thinking that was alive instead of the capital sins. But from those moments of failure, that's where we can learn from, and forgetting them, I believe, is an abyssal mistake.
Sí, aquí hay otra intervención.
Muchas gracias por tu
Thank you for your presentation. I simply wish to make a remark related to what Miguel said. Now I'm working on a cooperation project in the legal field in the Euro-Mediterranean area. Is financed by the European Commission. At a methodological level, if it is true that before it was the European Commission the one that fixed priorities that had to be followed within the framework of these projects, there was a change in methodology, a whole change in methodology. So it is the beneficiary countries, in this case the Mediterranean countries, the ones that have to assess what their needs are so that we can work on them. So perhaps there may be some evolution in these relations of hegemony and periphery. I agree with that, but when we speak about European Commission, it has its own interests, so it finances what it finances, irrespective of the advances that may be seen, and that in a way one has to be thankful to the European Commission sometimes. Is Europe beneficiary of those countries that it helps? Because they may, or they might help us in many ways. If I think of examples where Europe are beneficiaries from the African Mediterranean basin countries, there are not many examples. When it's always the same kind of countries that appear as beneficiaries and others as donors of the aid, there is a hierarchical evolution that may have evolved for the better or the worse. I share with you that it has gone for the better, but the hierarchical situation is still there. There are some who receive help and some that are the donors of the aid. That points to intellectuals like Sami Nair, who developed the concept of co-development. It cannot be conceived a Europe that does not look at its neighbors and that doesn't take care of that legacy and that reality which is there, that is moving in the Mediterranean with terrible statistics, which is an indignant reality, not for the poors, but for the reaction or lack of it that we have towards those circumstances. This author, Cassandra, was in the balcony of Europe to speak about that moral conscience of Europe, predicting that the disaster was close, and we are still in time to react. It is not a reality we are doomed to suffer as in a Greek drama, but we can take sides, and it's important not to call victory and to make the self-complacent discourse where everything is closed, everything is given or taken for granted, and that we should dare to look at the uncertain European future with a critical view, which will be the only way to avoid a tragical end. Are there any more comments? Just a little note. Watch out with terms like development, because it carries ideology. Truman opened the idea of the era of development. I think it's the point 8 or 18. He speaks in his speech of development and how the United States was interested in the development of other countries, and then there is a whole theory about this, the post-development, trans-development, the era of development, how the center and peripheries are interested in different types of development. So terms like development have an ideology behind. I think it is clear vision from the critique and from disillusionment sense. There is a lot to be improved, to criticize, to revise, if what we want is to try and keep alive this magnificent European dream that such a lot of good things have brought to us. It is true that sometimes you fall, you lose heart, and but it is true that Eduardo Galeano, as you have said, he said something that is brilliant but also paradoxical. That he said, "Let us keep pessimism for better times," which is a phrase that encapsulates everything. He read this in a graffiti in Bogota. Colombia is a country that has suffered a lot, that understands very well the word that convenes us here, peace, and that knows very well how important it is to multiply hope, particularly in critical moments. In these times of confusion, this discourse make us reflect, but we should agitate and to come from that intellectual nostalgia. Thank you for your presentation, and let's turn to a break.